Tonight we venture into dangerous territory. Not the kind that requires a passport or a safety harness, but the kind that requires something far more terrifying: radical honesty with yourself. We are entering the space between who you pretend to be at 3 p.m. when you're performing competence in a conference room and who you actually are at 3 a.m. when your carefully constructed persona finally clocks out, leaving you alone with the raw, unfiltered experience of being human. Here's the trinity of psychological warfare you've been waging against yourself: projection, self-sabotage, and that spiritual bypassing you've disguised as personal growth. You know that thing where you meditation away your anger, instead of asking why it exists in the first place, or where you affirmation away your sadness, instead of listening to what it's trying to tell you about the life you've outgrown. Forget the just be yourself advice floating around like psychological cotton candy. Your self has abandonment issues, a savior complex, and sends texts at 2 a.m. that your future self will read like evidence in a psychological crime scene. You say you're emotionally available, but flinch every time someone says, "We need to talk," because your nervous system treats emotional intimacy like a fire alarm going off in a library. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world at these contemplative hours. Now dim the lights, adjust the volume to something that won't startle your already overstimulated nervous system, and make sure your ego is in airplane mode. You're no longer in your bedroom scrolling through content to avoid your thoughts. You're in the consulting room of your own psyche, where the therapist is you, the patient is you, and the breakthrough you've been avoiding is also you. The good news your shadow wants to integrate, the bad news it brought wine unpacked all its childhood trauma, and has some very uncomfortable questions about why you keep choosing people who confirm your worst fears about yourself. This video is for the emotionally exhausted, for those who've discovered that spiritual bypassing is just emotional procrastination with better marketing, for anyone who's tired of carrying old wounds disguised as wisdom, outdated survival strategies, masquerading as personality traits. If you're here at this hour, chances are you're not just tired, you're tired of being tired, tired of the performance, tired of pretending that the life you're living is the life you actually chose rather than the life you settled for because choosing felt too dangerous. As Carl Jung once observed, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But here's what he didn't mention in that particular quote: the most exhausting thing is rejecting yourself partially every single day while pretending you're living authentically. It's like being your own undercover agent, constantly gathering intelligence on yourself while pretending you don't know what you're looking for. Let's talk about the elaborate psychological architecture you've constructed to avoid meeting yourself. It's impressive, really. You've built a fortress of productivity relationships and spiritual practices designed with one primary function: to keep you safely distanced from the raw, unfiltered experience of being you. This isn't conscious malice, it's unconscious self-preservation. Your psyche has been so efficient at protecting you from yourself that you've forgotten what you were originally hiding from. Your calendar is a masterpiece of avoidance. Every slot filled, every moment accounted for, because heaven forbid you should sit in silence long enough to hear what your soul actually has to say about the life you're living. You've confused being busy with being alive, motion with progress, noise with substance. You schedule meetings with everyone except the person who lives inside your skin. But here's the paradox that Jung understood so profoundly. The very things we use to escape ourselves are the things that ultimately imprison us. Your coping mechanisms have become your cage. Your survival strategies have outlived their usefulness, but continue operating like outdated software running in the background of your psyche, consuming energy, and creating glitches in your emotional operating system. The shadow knows this. It's been watching, waiting, taking notes every time you choose comfort over growth, every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you perform connection instead of risking authentic intimacy. Your shadow has been collecting evidence of your self-betrayal like a cosmic auditor preparing for the final reckoning. Think about your last relationship. Not the sanitized version you tell your therapist or post on social media, but the actual lived experience. How much of that relationship was you being yourself, and how much was you being who you thought you needed to be loved? How many times did you swallow your truth to keep the peace? How many times did you perform agreement when your soul was screaming disagreement? Your shadow remembers every single compromise. It remembers every time you diminished yourself to fit into someone else's comfort zone. It remembers every dream you abandoned because someone told you it wasn't practical. Every boundary you didn't set because you were afraid of conflict every time you chose to be liked over being known. And now in these quiet hours when the world sleeps and pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain, your shadow wants to have a conversation about the cost of all that self-abandonment. It wants to show you the receipts. It wants to ask you how much longer you're planning to be a stranger to yourself. The architecture of your internal exile isn't just about what you do, it's about what you don't do. It's about the dreams deferred, the conversations avoided, the feelings unfelt, the truths unspoken. It's about the life unlived while you were busy living the life you thought you were supposed to live. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to interface with the world. But what happens when the mask becomes so heavy that you forget there's a face underneath? What happens when you've been performing yourself for so long that you've lost track of who you actually are when no one is watching? This is the territory we're exploring tonight, not the comfortable territory of self-improvement, where you get to remain fundamentally the same while making minor adjustments to your behavior. No, we're venturing into the uncomfortable territory of self-confrontation, where you get to meet the parts of yourself you've been running from since childhood. Your internal exile wasn't a conscious choice. It was a survival strategy developed by a younger version of yourself who didn't have the resources to handle the full intensity of being human. That younger self made some very reasonable decisions about which parts of you were safe to express and which parts needed to be hidden away. But here's the thing about survival strategies: they're designed to get you through crisis, not to create a life worth living. There's a conversation happening in the depths of your psyche every night around 3 a.m. It's between the person you've become and the person you were meant to be. The person you've become is tired, defensive, explaining all the very reasonable decisions that led to this very reasonable life that feels like it belongs to someone else. This version of you has a detailed resume of compromises, a portfolio of rationalizations, and a filing cabinet full of reasons why things had to be this way. The person you were meant to be listens patiently, then asks the questions that make your chest tighten and your breath shallow. When did you decide that being loved was more important than being known? When did you conclude that safety was worth more than aliveness? When did you start believing that your dreams were too big for your reality, instead of recognizing that your reality had become too small for your dreams? When did you decide that other people's comfort was more important than your own truth? When did you conclude that you were too much, too intense, too sensitive to anything, instead of recognizing that you were surrounded by people who were too little? This is the conversation your shadow has been trying to have with you, not to destroy you, but to retrieve you, to call you back from the exile you didn't even realize you'd imposed upon yourself. Your shadow isn't the villain in your psychological story. It's the hero who never stopped looking for you, never stopped believing you were worth finding. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind. But let's be honest about what individuation actually feels like in practice. It feels like dying while still alive. It feels like watching everything you thought you were crumble away, leaving you raw and exposed, and somehow mysteriously more real than you've ever been. Individuation isn't a gentle Instagram-worthy transformation. It's not about finding yourself in some exotic location or through some ancient practice. It's about admitting you've been lost in plain sight, performing a version of yourself that was designed to be palatable rather than authentic. The midnight conversation you've been avoiding isn't just about the big decisions, the career you didn't pursue, the relationship you didn't end, the city you didn't move to. It's about the 1,000 small betrayals of self that happen every day. The way you laugh at jokes that aren't funny to avoid being seen as difficult. The way you nod along with opinions that contradict your values to maintain social harmony. The way you dress your truth in acceptable language until it becomes unrecognizable even to you. Your shadow has been keeping track of all of it. Every time you said fine when you meant this is not okay. Every time you said maybe when you meant absolutely not. Every time you said, "I don't mind," when you minded very much indeed. Your shadow is like a court reporter in the trial of your own authenticity, documenting every moment you testified against yourself. But here's what your shadow knows that your conscious mind has forgotten. You are not actually fine with a life that requires you to be someone else in order to be acceptable. You are not actually okay with relationships that demand you edit yourself down to a more manageable version. You are not actually content with a reality that feels like a compromise you never consciously agreed to make. The person you were meant to be isn't some idealized version of yourself. It's not your highest self or your best self or your most spiritual self. It's your most honest self. The self that exists before the editing, before the performance, before the careful curation of acceptability. It's the self that feels what it feels without apologizing, wants what it wants without shame, and says what it means without translation. This self hasn't disappeared. It's been waiting. In the spaces between your scheduled activities, in the moments between sleep and waking, in the pause between stimulus and response. It's been sending you signals through your body, the tightness in your chest. When you agree to something that violates your boundaries, the heaviness in your stomach. When you laugh at something that actually hurts, the fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to cure because you're exhausted from being someone you're not. Here's what no one tells you about becoming authentic. It's not a gentle self-help book kind of transformation. It's not about finding yourself through meditation retreats or vision boards or morning affirmations. It's about admitting that the person you've been presenting to the world is a character you've been playing so long, you forgot it was a performance. Authenticity is a sacred wound. It's the conscious choice to let yourself be seen in your imperfection, your confusion, your beautiful human messiness. It's the decision to stop being who you think you should be and start exploring who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. But here's the terrifying part: when you stop performing, some people will stop applauding. When you stop being who they need you to be, they might stop needing you at all. And that's the price of psychological freedom, the willingness to be disliked for who you are rather than loved for who you're not. Your shadow has been preparing you for this moment. Every time you felt like a fraud, that was your shadow saying, "We need to talk." Every time you felt exhausted by your own life, that was your shadow saying, "This isn't sustainable." Every time you looked in the mirror and felt like you were seeing a stranger, that was your shadow saying, "Remember me, I'm still here waiting." The sacred wound of authenticity isn't just about being honest with others. It's about being honest with yourself about the ways you've been dishonest with yourself. It's about admitting that you've been living your life according to someone else's blueprint, following someone else's map to someone else's destination, and wondering why you feel so lost. Think about the last time someone asked you what you wanted, and you genuinely didn't know. Not because the question was too complex, but because you'd been asking yourself what you should want for so long that you'd lost touch with your actual desires. This is the wound of authenticity, the recognition that you've become a stranger to your own wanting. Your desires aren't random. They're not frivolous or selfish or impractical. They're information. They're your soul's way of communicating what it needs to feel alive, to feel aligned, to feel like you're living your life, rather than someone else's idea of what your life should look like. But somewhere along the way you learned that your desires were problematic. Too big, too small, too weird, too ordinary, too much, too little. You learned to be ashamed of wanting what you want, to feel guilty for needing what you need, to feel selfish for prioritizing your own experience of being alive. And so you learned to want what you thought you should want. You learned to desire the things that would make you acceptable, lovable, successful by external standards. You learned to perform desire rather than feel it, to curate your wants into something more palatable, more reasonable, more aligned with who you thought you needed to be. But your shadow remembers what you actually wanted before you learned to want the right things. It remembers the dreams you had before you learned to have practical dreams. It remembers the version of you that existed before you learned to exist in a way that wouldn't upset anyone. The sacred wound of authenticity is the process of reconnecting with that original wanting. Not to indulge every desire impulsively, but to honor your desires as valid information about who you are and what your soul needs to thrive. It's about treating your own experience as valuable data rather than inconvenient noise. This process isn't comfortable. It requires you to disappoint, people who have become accustomed to your compliance. It requires you to set boundaries that might seem sudden to people who have been benefiting from your lack of boundaries. It requires you to say no to things you've been saying yes to and yes to things you've been saying no to. The people who truly love you will adjust. They might be confused at first, maybe even frustrated, but they'll adapt because their love for you isn't conditional on your performance of acceptability. The people who don't adjust, who become angry or punitive, when you start being honest about who you are and what you need, those people were never actually loving you. They were loving your compliance, your convenience, your willingness to be who they needed you to be. And here's the part that your perfectionist mind really doesn't want to hear. You're going to make mistakes as you learn to be authentic. You're going to overcorrect, sometimes swing too far in the other direction. You're going to be awkward and messy and imperfect as you figure out how to be real in a world that has rewarded you for being fake. That's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. The awkwardness is evidence that you're doing something new, something that matters, something that your soul has been waiting for. The discomfort is the sensation of growing, of stretching beyond the confines of who you thought you had to be. Jung spoke of psychological alchemy, the process of transforming the base metals of our unconscious patterns into the gold of conscious awareness. But alchemy isn't about changing what is. It's about accepting what is so completely that transformation becomes inevitable. It's about developing such a thorough relationship with your own psychological material that it has no choice but to reveal its hidden wisdom. You've been trying to change yourself from the outside in, but integration works from the inside out. You can't think your way into a new way of being, you have to feel your way there. And feeling requires the courage to stop numbing. Stop avoiding, stop spiritually bypassing the very emotions that contain your power. That anger you've been meditating away. It's not a bug in your system. It's a feature. It's information. It's your psyche's way of saying, this boundary has been crossed. That sadness you've been positive thinking out of existence. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. It's your soul grieving the life you've outgrown, making space for what wants to emerge. Your shadow isn't the enemy of your spiritual evolution. It's the fuel. Every repressed emotion, every denied aspect of self, every quality you've projected onto others, these aren't obstacles to wholeness. They are wholeness waiting to be reclaimed. But here's what makes shadow integration so challenging. It requires you to develop a relationship with the parts of yourself you've spent years trying to eliminate. It requires you to get curious about the very patterns you've been trying to fix. It requires you to approach your own dysfunction with compassion rather than condemnation. Take your people-pleasing, for example. You've probably spent considerable energy trying to stop being a people-pleaser, trying to force yourself to be more assertive, more boundaried, more willing to disappoint others. But what if instead of trying to eliminate your people-pleasing, you got curious about it? What if you asked it what it's trying to protect? What if you thanked it for all the ways it's tried to keep you safe? Your people-pleasing isn't random. It developed for good reasons. Maybe it kept you safe in a family system where conflict was dangerous. Maybe it was how you learned to receive love and attention. Maybe it was your way of managing anxiety in social situations. Your people-pleasing has been serving a function, even if that function has outlived its usefulness. Shadow integration isn't about getting rid of your people-pleasing, it's about bringing it into conscious relationship. It's about understanding when it serves you and when it doesn't, when it's appropriate and when it's not, when it's coming from love and when it's coming from fear. This same principle applies to every aspect of your shadow. Your procrastination isn't just laziness. It might be your psyche's way of protecting you from the terror of being seen in your full creative power. Your perfectionism isn't just neurosis. It might be your way of trying to earn love in a world that taught you that your value was conditional on your performance. Your jealousy, your selfishness, your neediness, your intensity, all of these qualities that you've been trying to spiritual practice away contain essential information about who you are and what you need. They're not problems to be solved. They're aspects of self to be integrated. But integration doesn't mean indulgence. It doesn't mean acting out every impulse or expressing every feeling without consideration for its impact. Integration means bringing unconscious patterns into conscious awareness so that you can choose how to express them rather than being driven by them unconsciously. When you're jealous, instead of shaming yourself for feeling jealous or trying, To think positive thoughts to make the jealousy go away, you can get curious about what the jealousy is telling you. What need isn't being met? What fear is being activated? What desire is being highlighted? Your jealousy becomes information rather than ammunition for self-attack. When you're angry, instead of spiritually bypassing the anger with forgiveness practices or positive affirmations, you can listen to what the anger is trying to communicate. What boundary has been crossed? What value has been violated? What part of you needs protection or advocacy? Your anger becomes a compass rather than a character flaw. This is the alchemy of shadow integration, transforming unconscious reaction into conscious response, transforming automatic patterns into intentional choices, transforming self-rejection into self-understanding. Here's the cosmic joke that Jung understood. The more you try to control your inner experience, the more chaotic it becomes. The more you try to perfect yourself, the more fragmented you feel. The more you try to transcend your humanity, the more imprisoned you become within it. Surrender isn't giving up, it's giving in. It's the recognition that your ego's attempts to manage your psychological process are like trying to perform surgery on yourself while looking in a funhouse mirror. Well-intentioned perhaps, but ultimately counterproductive and possibly dangerous. True surrender is the willingness to let your psyche reorganize itself according to its own deeper wisdom. It's trusting that the same intelligence that beats your heart and grows your hair and heals your wounds also knows how to heal your psyche if you stop interfering with the process. This doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming responsive rather than reactive. It means learning to dance with your psychological process rather than trying to choreograph it. It means accepting that your journey toward wholeness will be messy, non-linear, and utterly unique to you. But surrender is terrifying for the mind that has been trying to manage and control your inner experience for years. The ego believes that if it stops vigilantly monitoring and adjusting your thoughts and feelings, chaos will ensue. The ego believes that it is the only thing standing between you and complete psychological dissolution. What the ego doesn't understand is that its attempts at control are actually creating the very chaos it's trying to prevent. When you resist what you're feeling, you create internal tension. When you try to think your way out of emotional states, you create internal conflict. When you judge your experience as wrong or problematic, you create internal warfare. Surrender is the radical act of stepping out of the war with yourself. It's the recognition that you are not the enemy of your own experience. It's the understanding that your psyche is not trying to hurt you. It's trying to heal you, to integrate you, to make you whole. But surrender requires faith. Not religious faith, but psychological faith. Faith that your unconscious knows what it's doing even when your conscious mind doesn't understand the process. Faith that your symptoms are trying to communicate something important, even when you can't decode the message. Faith that your soul is leading you somewhere, even when you can't see the destination. This faith is particularly challenging in a culture that has taught you that you are the author of your own experience, that you can manifest anything you want, that you have complete control over your reality. While these concepts contain some truth, they can also become spiritual bypassing when they're used to avoid the messiness of actually being human. Sometimes you can't think your way to the other side of depression. Sometimes you can't affirmation your way out of anxiety. Sometimes you can't manifest your way around grief. Sometimes the only way through is through, and surrender is what allows the process to unfold organically, rather than forcing it to conform to your timeline or your expectations. Surrender is also the recognition that healing doesn't always look like healing. Sometimes integration looks like falling apart. Sometimes growth looks like regression. Sometimes progress looks like moving backward. Your psyche doesn't follow linear rational patterns because healing is not a linear rational process. When you surrender to your process, you give your unconscious permission to surface whatever needs to be seen, felt, and integrated. This might mean that old memories surface, old patterns intensify, old wounds reopen. This isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong, it's evidence that your psyche trusts you enough to show you what needs attention. The paradox of surrender is that by giving up control, you actually gain agency. When you stop fighting your experience, you can start working with it. When you stop trying to eliminate your symptoms, you can start listening to what they're trying to teach you. When you stop trying to fix yourself, you can start accepting yourself. and acceptance is the foundation of all genuine transformation. There comes a night, and it might be tonight, when you stop running from yourself. When you finally sit down with your shadow and say, "Okay, I'm listening. What do you need me to know?" This isn't a dramatic, cinematic moment. It's quiet, almost mundane. It's the simple act of stopping the constant motion long enough to have a conversation with the part of yourself you've been avoiding. This is the night when you realize that all your spiritual seeking, all your self-improvement efforts, all your attempts to become someone better, were actually just elaborate ways of avoiding becoming who you already are underneath all the conditioning. It's the night when you understand that you've been trying to find yourself everywhere except where you actually are. This is the night when you understand that healing isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about integrating what's been split off. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. It's not about transcending your humanity, it's about embracing it so completely that the divine has no choice but to shine through. Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." But awakening isn't a one-time event, it's a daily choice. The choice to meet yourself with curiosity rather than judgment. The choice to honor your complexity rather than trying to simplify yourself into spiritual sound bites. The night everything changes is often precipitated by what feels like everything falling apart. The relationship that finally ends, the job that no longer fits, the identity that suddenly feels like a costume that's 2 sizes too small. The spiritual practice that stops providing comfort, the coping mechanism that stops coping. What looks like breakdown is often breakthrough in disguise. What feels like losing yourself is often finding yourself. What seems like chaos is often your psyche's way of creating space for something new to emerge. But you have to be willing to stay present to the process rather than immediately trying to fix, improve, or spiritually bypass your way out of the discomfort. This is where most people turn back. This is where most people decide that growth is too uncomfortable, too unpredictable, too threatening to their sense of control. This is where most people choose the familiar prison over the unknown, freedom. But if you're here listening to this at this hour, chances are you're not most people. You're someone who has tasted enough authenticity to know that the performance is no longer sustainable. You're someone who has felt enough of your real self to know that the character you've been playing is starting to feel like a straitjacket. You're someone who has experienced enough inner deadness to know that being fully alive is worth the risk of being fully seen. The night everything changes is the night you stop asking, "How can I fix myself?" and start asking, "How can I love myself?" It's the night you stop treating your psyche like a problem to be solved and start treating it like a mystery to be explored. It's the night you stop trying to be who you think you should be and start being curious about who you actually are. This shift in orientation changes everything. Instead of approaching your anger as something to eliminate you, approach it as something to understand. Instead of seeing your sadness as evidence of your dysfunction, you see it as information about what your soul is grieving. Instead of viewing your desires as selfish or impractical, you view them as breadcrumbs leading you home to yourself. The night everything changes is also the night you realize that you don't need to wait for permission to be yourself. You don't need anyone else to validate your experience, approve of your choices, or understand your journey. You are the only person qualified to live your life, and you've been outsourcing that authority to people who don't even know what it feels like to be inside your skin. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means you get to choose. Terrifying because it means you have to choose. You can no longer blame your circumstances, your upbringing, your genetics, or your past for the life you're living. You become responsible for your own experience. But responsibility isn't the same as blame. You're not responsible for what happened to you, but you are responsible for what you do with what happened to you. You're not responsible for the cards you were dealt, but you are responsible for how you play your hand. You're not responsible for the conditioning you received, but you are responsible for examining that conditioning and deciding which parts still serve you and which parts need to be composted. Integration isn't about getting rid of the parts of yourself you don't like. It's about finding a way for all parts of yourself to coexist consciously. It's about creating internal democracy rather than internal dictatorship. It's about learning to be the loving parent to your own psyche that you perhaps never had. Your angry part needs recognition, not elimination. Your fearful part needs compassion, not courage injections. Your sad part needs witnessing, not cheering up. Your shadow doesn't need to be fixed, it needs to be integrated. And integration happens not through force, but through relationship. Start having conversations with the parts of yourself you've been trying to exile. Ask them what they need. Ask them what they're protecting. Ask them what they're afraid will happen if they relax their vigilance. You might be surprised by the wisdom they contain, the ways they've been trying to serve you, even in their dysfunction. Your perfectionism, for example, might reveal that it's been trying to protect you from criticism, from rejection, from the devastating possibility that you might not be good enough. Your people-pleasing might share that it's been trying to ensure that you're loved, that you belong, that you won't be abandoned. Your procrastination might admit that it's been trying to protect you from the terror of being seen in your full creative power. None of these patterns are inherently problematic. They become problematic when they're unconscious, when they're running the show without your awareness or consent. But when you bring them into conscious relationship, they can become allies rather than adversaries. Integration also requires you to reclaim the qualities you've projected onto others, the parts of yourself that you've deemed unacceptable, and therefore see in everyone else, the anger you've disowned that you criticize in your partner, the neediness you've rejected that you judge in your friends, the power you've given away, that you resent in your boss. Every strong reaction you have to someone else is information about a disowned part of yourself. Every judgment you make is a clue about something you're not accepting within your own psyche. Every person who triggers you is a mirror showing you something about yourself that you haven't been willing to see. This doesn't mean that everyone else's behavior is acceptable or that you shouldn't have boundaries. It means that your emotional charge around other people's behavior is usually more about you than it is about them. It means that your triggers are doorways to your own healing. When someone's anger triggers you, it might be because you've disowned your own anger and therefore can't handle seeing it expressed. When someone's vulnerability makes you uncomfortable, it might be because you've armored yourself against your own tenderness. When someone's success triggers your jealousy, it might be because you've given up on your own dreams and can't handle seeing someone else living theirs. Integration means taking responsibility for your projections. It means recognizing that the world outside is often a reflection of the world inside. It means understanding that changing your internal relationship to yourself will naturally change your external relationships with others. But integration isn't just about reclaiming your shadow, it's also about integrating your light. Many people are actually more afraid of their power than they are of their powerlessness. More afraid of their brilliance than they are of their inadequacy. More afraid of their capacity for love than they are of their capacity for hatred. You might have learned early that it wasn't safe to be too bright, too talented, too successful, too happy. You might have learned to dim your light so that others wouldn't feel threatened to play small, so that others would feel comfortable to hide your gifts, so that others wouldn't feel inadequate. But hiding your light serves nobody. When you dim yourself to make others comfortable, you're not being humble, you're being dishonest. You're depriving the world of your unique contribution, your particular way of being human, your specific gifts and talents and perspectives. Integration means claiming all of who you are, the light and the shadow, the beautiful and the ugly, the powerful and the vulnerable. It means becoming comfortable with being a complex, multifaceted human being who can't be reduced to simple categories or easy explanations. This complexity is not a problem to be solved, it's the human condition to be embraced. You contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman so beautifully expressed. You are large enough to hold contradictions, paradoxes, and seeming inconsistencies. You don't have to make sense to anyone else, you just have to make sense to yourself. The hero's journey isn't about slaying the dragon, it's about recognizing that you are the dragon. The treasure you seek isn't out there in the world, it's in the cave you've been afraid to enter, the cave of your own unconscious. The monster you've been running from is actually the guardian of everything you've been looking for. Your shadow isn't your enemy, it's your ally in exile. It's been waiting in the darkness, holding all the energy you've rejected, all the power. You've disowned all the authenticity you've been too afraid to embody. And it's tired of waiting. It's tired of being the repository for everything you can't accept about yourself. Tonight, you have a choice. You can continue the exhausting work of keeping your shadow at bay, maintaining the performance, pretending that the life you're living is the life you want. Or you can extend an invitation. Shadow, it's time to come home. This homecoming won't be comfortable. It will be real. And real, as Jung knew, is the only foundation upon which genuine transformation can occur. Real is messy and unpredictable, and sometimes overwhelming. Real doesn't fit into Instagram quotes or self-help formulas. Real requires you to be present to whatever arises without immediately trying to fix change or improve it. But real is also where your power lives. Real is where your creativity emerges. Real is where authentic connection becomes possible. Real is where you remember that you are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The return of your shadow doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process of recognition, acceptance, and integration. You start to notice the patterns you've been unconscious of. You start to feel the feelings you've been avoiding. You start to want the things you've been denying you want. This process can be destabilizing. People in your life might not recognize this more authentic version of you. They might resist the changes, might try to pull you back into the familiar patterns, might even become angry or punitive when you stop playing the role they've become accustomed to. This is where you'll be tested. This is where you'll discover whether your commitment to authenticity is stronger than your need for approval. This is where you'll learn the difference between being loved for who you are and being loved for who you're willing to pretend to be. Some relationships will deepen as you become more real. People who have been waiting for the authentic you will breathe a sigh of relief and step forward to meet you in your truth. But other relationships might end or change significantly. People who were invested in your false self might not know how to relate to your true self. This is one of the most challenging aspects of shadow integration, accepting that not everyone will be able to make the journey with you. Some people will stay in the familiar territory of surface-level connection, performance-based relating, and mutual enabling of each other's unconsciousness. But you can't save anyone else by staying small. You can't help anyone else grow by refusing to grow yourself. You can't love anyone else into wholeness by remaining fragmented. The most generous thing you can do for the people in your life is to become fully yourself, even if that makes them uncomfortable. Every shadow contains a gift, and every gift contains a shadow. The very wound that you've been trying to heal, the pattern you've been trying to break, the aspect of yourself you've been trying to fix, these contain the seeds of your greatest contribution to the world. But you have to be willing to stop seeing your wound as your weakness and start seeing it as your raw material. Your sensitivity, which you've probably been told is too much, is actually your superpower in disguise. Your intensity, which others have asked you to tone down, is the fuel for your passion and creativity. Your emotional complexity, which you've been trying to simplify, is actually your capacity for deep understanding and authentic connection. The parts of yourself that feel most problematic are often the parts that contain your greatest gifts. Your perfectionism might be your gift for excellence trying to emerge. Your people-pleasing might be your gift for harmony and connection trying to find healthy expression. Your rebelliousness might be your gift for innovation and change trying to break free. But these gifts can only emerge when you stop trying to eliminate the patterns and start trying to understand them. When you stop seeing your shadow as your enemy and start seeing it as your teacher. When you stop trying to transcend your humanity and start embracing it as the raw material for your unique contribution. Jung understood that the goal isn't to become perfect, it's to become whole. Wholeness includes everything, the light and the dark, the beautiful and the ugly, the sacred and the profane. Wholeness means accepting that you are a human being, not a human doing, and that your value doesn't depend on your performance or your ability to meet anyone else's expectations. Your original wound, the early experience that shaped your defensive patterns, isn't something to be cured, it's something to be understood. It's the place where life broke you open so that light could get in. It's the crack in your armor that allows your authenticity to shine through. It's the source of your empathy, your wisdom, your capacity to help others who are struggling with similar challenges. Think about the people who have most impacted your life, the teachers, the healers, the artists, the leaders who have touched your soul. Chances are they weren't perfect people who had transcended all their human challenges. They were people who had learned to transform their wounds into wisdom, their pain into purpose, their struggles into strength. Your shadow work isn't about becoming someone different, it's about becoming more yourself. It's about reclaiming the aspects of yourself that you disowned in order to survive, in order to be loved, in order to fit in. It's about recognizing that what you thought were your greatest weaknesses might actually be your greatest strengths in disguise. The alchemy happens when you stop trying to change your essential nature and start learning to express it more consciously. When you stop seeing your patterns as problems and start seeing them as information. When you stop judging your process and start trusting it. But this alchemy requires patience. It requires the willingness to stay in relationship with yourself, even when that relationship is uncomfortable. It requires the courage to keep exploring, even when you don't like what you find. It requires the faith to keep going, even when you can't see where you're headed. Your shadow has been waiting for this recognition. It's been holding your disowned gifts, your unexpressed creativity, your unlived life. It's been guarding the treasure that you've been seeking everywhere except where it actually is, within the very aspects of yourself you've been trying to escape. One of the deepest human needs is to be truly seen, not for who we pretend to be, but for who we actually are underneath all the masks and performances. Yet this same need is often our greatest fear. To be truly seen means to risk being rejected, not for our false self, but for our true self. And that rejection feels like annihilation. So we develop elaborate strategies to be seen without being seen. We reveal ourselves selectively, showing only the parts we think are acceptable, while keeping the messy, complex, contradictory parts hidden. We perform vulnerability, instead of feeling it, curate authenticity, instead of living it, manage our image instead of trusting our essence. But partial visibility is actually a form of invisibility. When you only show the parts of yourself that you think others can handle, you remain fundamentally unknown. You might be loved, but you're loved for a character you're playing, not for the person you actually are. Your shadow contains all the parts of yourself you've deemed too risky to reveal. Your anger, your neediness, your jealousy, your grandiosity, your pettiness, your confusion. These aspects of your humanity have been banished to the unconscious because you learned early that they were unacceptable, that expressing them would result in rejection, punishment, or abandonment. But here's the paradox. The parts of yourself you've been most afraid to show are often the parts that others find most relatable. Your perfectly curated Instagram feed might get likes, but your honest middle-of-the-night struggles are what create real connection. Your professional achievements might earn respect, but your vulnerable admissions of uncertainty are what inspire trust. The terror of being seen is really the terror of being rejected for who you actually are. But there's an equal terror that we don't often acknowledge, the terror of being loved for who we actually are. Because being truly loved means being truly responsible for that love. It means you can no longer blame your loneliness on your inability to find someone who understands you. When someone sees you clearly, your light and your shadow, your gifts and your flaws, your beauty and your brokenness, and chooses to love you anyway, it shatters every story you've told yourself about why you're unlovable. It challenges every defense. You've built every wall you've constructed, every reason you've given yourself for why intimate connection isn't possible. Being truly seen also means giving up the fantasy that if you could just perfect yourself enough, hide your flaws well enough, perform your worthiness convincingly enough, then you would finally be worthy of love. Being seen means accepting that you are worthy of love not because you're perfect, but because you're human. But being seen isn't just about romantic relationships. It's about being authentic in all your relationships with friends, family, colleagues, even strangers. It's about showing up as yourself rather than as who you think others need you to be. It's about speaking your truth rather than saying what you think others want to hear. This doesn't mean being inappropriate or boundaryless. It doesn't mean dumping your emotional baggage on everyone you meet. It means being honest about your experience, your feelings, your needs, your limitations. It means admitting when you don't know something, rather than pretending to have answers you don't have. It means expressing disagreement when you disagree, rather than nodding along to maintain false harmony. The ecstasy of being seen is the relief of finally being able to stop performing. It's the joy of discovering that you are lovable, exactly as you are with all your human messiness and complexity. It's the freedom of no longer having to remember which version of yourself you're supposed to be with which person. But being seen also requires you to see others clearly. It requires you to stop projecting your own issues onto them, stop expecting them to be perfect, stop demanding that they be who you need them to be, rather than who they actually are. Being seen is reciprocal. It's about creating relationships based on reality rather than fantasy. Your shadow work prepares you for this level of intimacy. As you become more comfortable with your own darkness, you become more comfortable with others' darkness. As you stop trying to perfect yourself, you stop demanding perfection from others. As you learn to love yourself in your wholeness, you become capable of loving others in their wholeness. What we often call the dark night of the soul, those periods of existential crisis, spiritual emptiness and profound questioning, are actually initiations in disguise. They're the soul's way of stripping away everything that isn't essential, everything that isn't authentic, everything that belongs to the false self rather than the true self. These dark nights often come after periods of spiritual seeking, after you've tried all the practices, and read all the books and attended all the workshops, only to find yourself feeling more lost than when you started. They come when the spiritual bypassing stops working, when the positive thinking can no longer mask the underlying depression, when the manifestation techniques fail to manifest anything except more frustration. The dark night is your soul's rebellion against the spiritual. Materialism that promises transcendence without transformation, enlightenment without embodiment, healing without feeling. It's your psyche's way of saying enough with the spiritual theater. It's time to get real. During these dark nights, everything you thought you knew about yourself, about spirituality, about the meaning of life, gets called into question. The practices that once brought comfort feel empty. The beliefs that once provided certainty feel hollow. The identity you've constructed around being a spiritual person crumbles, leaving you feeling raw and exposed and profoundly lost. This isn't spiritual failure, it's spiritual maturation. It's the difference between spiritual adolescence, where you're still trying to use spirituality to avoid the human condition, and spiritual adulthood, where you recognize that spirituality is about fully embracing the human condition. The dark night forces you to confront the shadow of your spiritual seeking. Maybe you've been using meditation to avoid difficult emotions rather than to relate to them more skillfully. Maybe you've been using spiritual concepts to bypass psychological work rather than to support it. Maybe you've been pursuing enlightenment as another form of perfectionism rather than as a deepening into wholeness. Jung experienced his own dark night, which he documented in his Red Book. For years he felt lost, disconnected from his previous certainties, forced to navigate by feel rather than by familiar landmarks. But this period of disorientation ultimately led to his most profound insights about the human psyche, about the process of individuation, about the necessity of integrating rather than transcending our humanity. The dark night is often triggered by loss, the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, the collapse of a career, the failure of a dream. But the real loss isn't external. It's the death of who you thought you were, who you thought you needed to be, who you thought others needed you to be. This death is terrifying because the ego experiences it as actual annihilation. The ego doesn't understand that this death is actually a birth, that what's dying is what was never authentic anyway, that what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. But the dark night requires you to be present to the process rather than trying to escape it. It requires you to stop trying to fix yourself back to your previous state and start trusting that this disintegration is actually a form of integration. It requires you to stop asking, how do I get out of this, and start asking, what is this trying to teach me? The dark night strips away your spiritual pretenses and forces you to encounter yourself without the buffer of spiritual concepts or practices. It's you alone with your humanity, with no escape route, no spiritual bypasses, no way to avoid the raw reality of being a complex, imperfect, struggling human being. But in this stripping away, something essential is revealed. Underneath all the spiritual seeking, underneath all the self-improvement efforts, underneath all the attempts to become someone better, there's a core self that has always been whole, that has never needed fixing, that has been waiting patiently for you to stop trying to transcend it and start trusting it. The dark night is ultimately about surrender, not the kind of surrender that spiritual teachers talk about in workshops, but the kind of surrender that happens when you have no other choice, when all your strategies have failed, when all your beliefs have crumbled, when all your attempts at control have proven futile. This surrender isn't defeat, it's liberation. It's the recognition that the thing you've been trying to control, your spiritual development, your psychological healing, your life circumstances, was never yours to control in the first place. It's the understanding that your job isn't to direct the process, but to participate in it. In a culture that profits from your self-hatred, self-acceptance is a revolutionary act. In a world that has convinced you that you're not enough as you are, that you need to be improved, fixed, upgraded, optimized, the simple act of accepting yourself exactly as you are in this moment is radical rebellion. But self-acceptance isn't passive resignation. It's not giving up on growth or settling for dysfunction. It's the recognition that all genuine transformation begins with acceptance of what is. You can't change what you won't acknowledge. You can't heal what you're fighting against. You can't integrate what you're rejecting. Self-acceptance is the foundation of shadow work because it creates the internal safety necessary for exploration. When you stop attacking yourself for having certain thoughts, feelings, or patterns, you create space for curiosity about why they exist. When you stop trying to eliminate aspects of yourself, you can start to understand their function and purpose. Your perfectionism exists for a reason. Your people-pleasing developed for good reasons. Your emotional walls were built to protect something valuable. Your defense mechanisms have been trying to keep you safe. Self-acceptance allows you to appreciate these patterns for the ways they've served you, while also recognizing when they've outlived their usefulness. But self-acceptance is perhaps the most difficult practice for most people, because it requires you to give up the fantasy that you can perfect your way into worthiness. It requires you to accept that you are worthy, not because you're perfect, but because you exist. It requires you to recognize that your value isn't dependent on your achievements, your productivity, your likability, or your ability to meet anyone else's expectations. Self-acceptance also means accepting your limitations, accepting that you're not going to be good at everything, accepting that you're not going to be liked by everyone, accepting that you're not going to be able to control how others perceive you or respond to you, accepting that you're human, which means you're imperfect by design. This doesn't mean accepting abusive behavior from others or settling for situations that don't serve you. Self-acceptance actually makes boundaries easier, because when you stop rejecting parts of yourself, you become clearer about what you need and what you're willing to tolerate from others. When you accept your sensitivity, you can create boundaries that protect it, rather than trying to toughen up to fit into environments that don't honor sensitivity. When you accept your need for solitude, you can prioritize it rather than forcing yourself to be social when you need space. When you accept your particular way of processing information, you can work with your natural rhythms rather than against them. Self-acceptance is also the antidote to comparison. When you truly accept yourself as you are, others' accomplishments don't threaten your sense of worth. Their successes don't highlight your failures because you're not measuring your value against external metrics anymore. But self-acceptance isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's something you choose moment by moment, day by day. There will be times when you slip back into self-rejection, self-criticism, self-improvement mode. That's part of the human experience. The practice is noticing when you've left acceptance and gently returning to it. Self-acceptance also extends to accepting your process of learning self-acceptance. You don't have to be good at accepting yourself. You don't have to accept yourself perfectly. You just have to keep choosing acceptance over rejection, curiosity over criticism, compassion over condemnation. The revolutionary nature of self-acceptance lies in its refusal to participate in the cultural narrative that you are a problem to be solved. It's the recognition that you are a human being, worthy of love and belonging, not because of what you do or achieve, but because of what you are. Shadow work isn't just about dramatic breakthroughs in therapy or profound realizations during meditation, retreats. It's about the daily practice of paying attention to your inner experience with curiosity rather than judgment. It's about noticing your reactions, your projections, your automatic patterns, and choosing consciousness over unconsciousness in small moments throughout your day. It's about catching yourself when you're about to people please, and asking, what am I afraid will happen if I speak my truth right now? It's about noticing when you're procrastinating and getting curious about what you're avoiding, rather than beating yourself up for not being productive enough. Shadow work happens in your morning coffee routine, when you notice the anxiety that you usually caffeinate away. It happens in your evening wind down, when you feel the loneliness that you typically scroll away on your phone. It happens in your interactions with colleagues, when you notice the anger that you usually swallow to maintain professionalism. The sacred ordinary of shadow work is about treating your daily emotional experience as worthy of attention, as containing valuable information about your inner landscape. It's about recognizing that your trigger in traffic isn't just about the other driver. It's about something unresolved within you. Your irritation with your partner's habit isn't just about the habit. It's about something you're not accepting about yourself. This doesn't mean everything is always about you or that external circumstances don't matter. It means that your emotional response to external circumstances is always information about your internal state. It means that your reactions are doorways to self-understanding if you're willing to walk through them. Daily shadow work is also about noticing your internal dialogue, the voice in your head that provides constant commentary about your experience, your appearance, your performance, your worth. Most people are unconscious of this internal narrator, but it has enormous influence over how you feel about yourself and how you move through the world. Start paying attention to the tone of your inner voice. Is it compassionate or critical? Encouraging or undermining, curious or judgmental? Would you speak to a friend the way you speak to yourself in your mind? If not, why is it acceptable to treat yourself that way? Shadow work means developing the capacity to witness your inner experience without immediately trying to change it. It means creating internal space between the observer and the observed, between the part of you that's having an experience and the part of you that's aware of having that experience. This witnessing capacity is what allows choice to emerge. When you're unconscious of your patterns, you're trapped by them. When you become conscious of them, you can choose how to respond rather than being driven by automatic reactions. But daily, shadow work also requires self-compassion. When you start paying attention to your inner experience, you're going to notice things you don't like. You're going to see patterns you wish you didn't have, thoughts you wish you didn't think, feelings you wish you didn't feel. The temptation will be to use this awareness as ammunition for self-attack. Now, I can see how screwed up I really am. But awareness isn't meant to be another weapon in your arsenal of self-improvement. It's meant to be a tool for self-understanding and self-compassion. When you notice a pattern, instead of immediately trying to fix it, try getting curious about it. When did this pattern develop? What was it trying to protect? How has it served you? What would it feel like to appreciate this pattern for the ways it's tried to help you, even if it's no longer serving you? Daily shadow work is about small shifts in consciousness that accumulate over time into significant transformation. It's about choosing curiosity over criticism in micro moments throughout your day. It's about treating yourself as someone worthy of understanding, rather than someone in need of constant improvement. One of the most challenging aspects of shadow integration is developing the courage to disappoint others. Most of your shadow material has been created by your attempts to be who others need you to be, rather than who you actually are. Your people-pleasing, your perfectionism, your self-abandonment. These patterns developed as strategies for gaining love, approval, and belonging, but maintaining these patterns requires you to continuously betray yourself. Every time you say yes, when you mean no, every time you perform agreement, when you actually disagree, every time you diminish yourself to make others comfortable, you abandon yourself in service of maintaining others' approval. The courage to disappoint others is really the courage to be authentic. It's the recognition that disappointing others by being yourself is preferable to disappointing yourself by being someone else. It's the understanding that people who are upset by your authenticity were never actually loving you. They were loving your compliance. But this courage doesn't develop overnight. It requires you to gradually build your tolerance for others' disappointment, disapproval, or displeasure. It requires you to practice setting small boundaries before you attempt to set major ones. It requires you to develop internal validation so that you're not dependent on external approval for your sense of worth. Start with low-stakes situations. Practice saying no to invitations you don't want to accept. Practice expressing preferences when asked what you want to do. Practice giving honest feedback when asked for your opinion. Notice what happens in your body when you tell the truth, instead of saying what you think others want to hear. You'll probably feel anxiety, guilt, or fear when you first start disappointing others. This is normal. These feelings are the emotional residue of old programming that taught you that other people's comfort is more important than your own integrity. But feelings are just feelings, they're not facts and they're not commands. The anxiety you feel when you set a boundary isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something new. The guilt you feel when you prioritize your needs isn't proof that you're being selfish. It's proof that you've been trained to abandon yourself for others' benefit. As you practice the courage to disappoint others, you'll discover something remarkable. Most people actually respect authenticity more than they respect compliance. People can sense when you're being genuine and when you're performing, even if they can't articulate it. Authentic expression often inspires others to be more authentic themselves, but some people will be upset by your newfound authenticity. Some people have become accustomed to your self-abandonment and will resist your attempts to reclaim yourself. They might accuse you of being selfish, difficult, or changed. They might try to guilt you back into your old patterns. This is where your commitment to yourself will be tested. This is where you'll discover whether your desire for authenticity is stronger than your need for approval. This is where you'll learn to distinguish between people who love you and people who love what you do for them. The courage to disappoint others is ultimately about choosing yourself, not in a narcissistic way, but in a self-honoring way. It's about recognizing that you matter too, that your needs are valid, that your experience is important, that your life is your responsibility. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate. It means becoming honest about what you actually want and need instead of pretending to want and need what you think others want you to want and need. It means taking responsibility for your own happiness instead of expecting others to manage your emotions for you. When you stop abandoning yourself to please others, you paradoxically become more genuinely giving. When your giving comes from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from love rather than fear, it nourishes both you and the recipient. Underneath all the conditioning, beneath all the adaptations, beyond all the strategies for survival and belonging, there exists what we might call your original self. This isn't some idealized version of who you should be, it's who you were before. You learned that being yourself wasn't safe or acceptable. Your original self is the part of you that exists before socialization, before you learned to perform acceptability, before you developed strategies for managing others' reactions to you. It's the self that feels what it feels without apology, wants what it wants without shame, expresses what it needs to express without translation. Children are naturally in touch with their original self until they learn that certain aspects of their nature are problematic. They cry when they're sad, rage when they're angry, express joy without self-consciousness, ask for what they need without elaborate justifications. They haven't yet learned to be ashamed of their humanity. But as we grow up, we learn to edit ourselves. We learn which emotions are acceptable and which need to be hidden. We learn which desires are appropriate and which need to be suppressed. We learn which aspects of our personality are charming and which are problematic. This editing process isn't entirely bad. It's part of learning to live in relationship with others, part of developing empathy and social skills. But many of us edited ourselves so thoroughly that we lost touch with our original nature. We became so skilled at being who others needed us to be that we forgot who we actually were underneath all the performance. Shadow work is in many ways about returning to your original self, not to become childish or irresponsible, but to reclaim the authenticity, spontaneity, and aliveness that you may have lost in your efforts to be acceptable. Your original self isn't hidden in some distant past that you need to recover through therapy or regression work. It's present right now, in this moment, underneath all the layers of conditioning. It's the part of you that feels excited about certain possibilities, that feels drained by certain obligations, that feels angry about certain injustices, that feels moved by certain beauty. But accessing your original self requires you to slow down enough to feel what you're actually feeling, rather than what you think you should be feeling. It requires you to get quiet enough to hear what you actually want, rather than what you think you should want. It requires you to get still enough to sense what your body is telling you, rather than what your mind thinks you should do. Your original self speaks through your energy levels. Notice what activities energize you and what activities drain you. Notice which people leave you feeling more alive and which people leave you feeling depleted. Notice which environments support your natural rhythms and which ones feel forced or artificial. Your original self also speaks through your spontaneous reactions before you edit them for appropriateness. Notice your first response to invitations, requests, or opportunities before you start analyzing whether your response is reasonable or socially acceptable. Notice what you're drawn to before you talk yourself out of it. The return to your original self isn't about regressing to childhood or abandoning adult responsibilities. It's about bringing the authenticity of your original nature into mature, conscious expression. It's about learning to be genuinely yourself in relationship with others, rather than performing a version of yourself that you think others prefer. This return often feels like coming home to yourself after a long journey. It feels like remembering something you always knew, but had forgotten. It feels like permission to be who you've always been, underneath all the efforts to be someone else. But this return also requires courage, because your original self might not be who others expect you to be. Your original self might be more sensitive than others, are comfortable with more intense than others prefer, more unconventional than others approve of. Your original self might want things that others don't understand, need things that others can't provide, express things that others find threatening. The return to your original self is ultimately about trusting that who you naturally are is enough. It's about believing that you don't need to improve yourself to be worthy of love and belonging. It's about recognizing that your natural state is wholeness, not brokenness, and that all the healing and growth is really about removing the obstacles to expressing that wholeness. As we come to the end of our journey together tonight, it's important to understand that shadow work isn't a destination. It's a way of being in relationship with yourself. It's not something you complete, it's something you practice. It's not about achieving perfect integration. It's about maintaining conscious relationship with all aspects of your psyche. Your shadow will continue to evolve as you evolve. New aspects of yourself will emerge that need to be integrated. Old patterns will resurface when you're under stress or facing new challenges. The work of consciousness is ongoing, just like the work of physical health or emotional well-being. But this ongoing nature of the work isn't a burden, it's a gift. It means that you get to keep discovering new depths of yourself, keep uncovering new aspects of your humanity, keep finding new ways to be authentic and whole. It means that growth and discovery can continue throughout your entire life. The relationship between your light and shadow isn't a battle to be won, it's a dance to be danced. Sometimes your shadow will lead helping you access your power, your boundaries, your capacity for healthy selfishness. Sometimes your light will lead helping you express your love, your creativity, your capacity for generous service. The goal isn't to eliminate the shadow or perfect the light. The goal is to develop such a conscious relationship with both that you can choose how to express them in any given moment. It's about having access to your full range of human experience, rather than being limited to only the acceptable parts. This consciousness changes everything. It changes how you relate to your emotions, seeing them as information rather than problems. It changes how you relate to others, seeing their shadows as human rather than shameful. It changes how you relate to conflict, seeing it as an opportunity for deeper understanding rather than something to be avoided. Most importantly, consciousness changes how you relate to yourself. You become curious about your patterns rather than critical of them. You become compassionate toward your struggles rather than judgmental about them. You become patient with your process rather than demanding immediate transformation. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that the conversation with your shadow doesn't end here. It continues in your dreams, in your quiet moments, in your reactions to daily life. It continues every time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over performance, self-acceptance over self-improvement. Your shadow has been waiting for this recognition for so long. It's tired of being the repository for everything you can't accept about yourself. It wants to contribute to your wholeness, to add its energy to your authentic expression, to help you become more fully yourself. The integration we've explored tonight isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. It's about choosing to be a whole human being rather than a partial one. It's about embracing your complexity rather than trying to simplify yourself into spiritual sound bites. As you move forward from tonight, carry with you the understanding that you are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. You are not broken and in need of fixing, but whole and in need of integration. You are not required to be anyone other than who you authentically are. The night you stop pretending is the night you start living. And perhaps after our time together tonight, you're ready to begin. Write in the comments, "I choose to integrate my shadow." Let's see how many souls are ready for this level of radical honesty with themselves. Let's create a community of people committed to wholeness rather than perfection, to authenticity rather than performance. And tell me what aspects of shadow work you'd like to explore in future videos. What patterns are you ready to understand? Rather than eliminate, what parts of yourself are you ready to welcome home? Your responses help guide our continued journey into the depths of human consciousness. Until we meet again in this sacred space of exploration, remember, your shadow is not your enemy. It's your forgotten ally, waiting patiently for you to stop running and start integrating. The treasure you seek has been within you all along, hidden in the very places you've been afraid to look. May your dreams tonight be filled with integration rather than fragmentation, with self-acceptance rather than self-rejection, with the courage to be exactly who you are in a world that has tried to convince you to be someone else. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. The journey home to yourself is the only journey that truly matters.